The security guard had Elijah Carter's arm twisted up behind his back before anyone in the hallway understood what was happening. "Get your hands off him," a voice cracked from the doorway. But it didn't matter yet, because the man being dragged toward the service elevator in a stained gray uniform was, as far as the hospital's night administrator was concerned, nobody. Just the mop and bucket guy who'd wandered somewhere he had no business being, saying things he had no right to say. "You don't know what you're talking about," the administrator hissed, adjusting his tie like the words themselves were an inconvenience to his evening. 20 feet away, behind a pane of reinforced glass, a 7-year-old boy named Noah Ellison lay dying of something 4 attending physicians couldn't name. And the only man in the building who could have told them what it was being marched out the back exit like a trespasser. Stories like this stay with you. Hit subscribe, because what happened in the next 11 minutes would change the way that hospital treated every person who ever walked through its doors again. Now let's go back to where it all started. 8 hours earlier, St. Augustine Children's Hospital was quiet in the particular way hospitals are quiet at dinner time. Not empty, just paused. The day shift trading places with the night shift in the flat fluorescent light of the West Wing. Elijah Carter pushed his cart down the corridor outside the pediatric surgical recovery unit, the way he pushed it every evening, 5 nights a week, methodical and unremarked upon. A man built like he'd once carried heavier things than a mop, and now carried them anyway out of habit. He was 39 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way his gray janitorial uniform did nothing to disguise, with a quiet, closed-off face that had learned, a long time ago, not to invite conversation from people who weren't going to offer any back. His badge said Carter, E. Environmental Services. Nothing on it said what he actually knew. Nobody at St. Augustine had reason to guess that the man buffing the floor outside room 412 had once been Hospital Corpsman First Class Elijah Carter, attached to a Marine reconnaissance unit, the person other men bled in front of when there was no surgeon within 80 miles. 2 deployments, 11 months, cumulative, spent treating things the manuals didn't cover, fevers that didn't match any textbook, infections that moved faster than protocol allowed for, bodies breaking down in ways that forced you to think sideways instead of by the book. Because by the book, men died. He had come home with steady hands and a mind that never fully stopped cataloging symptoms, even when he begged it to. After his wife Renee died 4 years ago. An aggressive autoimmune complication that no one caught until it was catching nothing anymore. Elijah had made a decision that some people found admirable and others found impossible to understand. He had walked away from medicine entirely, not because he'd lost his nerve, because the last time his instincts had screamed at him that something was wrong, and he had been too exhausted, too grieving, too unsure of his own authority in a room full of people with diplomas. He had said nothing. He told himself he was just her husband, not her doctor. He signed her death certificate 9 days later. He had not set foot inside a hospital as anything other than a paycheck since. The environmental services job wasn't beneath him. That was the thing nobody understood, and the thing he never bothered explaining. It let him work nights, which meant he could get his daughter Maya to school himself every morning, walk her the 4 blocks himself, braid her hair himself when the mornings were slow enough to allow it. Maya was 6, sharp-eyed and serious in the way only children raised by one exhausted, devoted parent tend to be. And she carried a stuffed rabbit named Biscuit everywhere she went, its left ear chewed soft and gray from years of anxious thumb and fabric worry. That evening she was in the staff break room 2 floors up, coloring at a folding table under the watch of Dolores, the night supervisor who let Maya come in on the evenings when the sitter fell through, because Dolores had raised 4 kids of her own and understood what it cost a man to keep every plate spinning alone. Elijah checked on her every hour on his rounds, the way he always did. A hand on her shoulder, a look at her drawing, 3 words exchanged, and then back to the cart, back to the corridors, back to being no one in particular. It was a small routine, and it would look like nothing to anyone watching from outside it, but it was the entire architecture his life had been rebuilt around since Renee died. Get Maya up, get her fed, get her to school, get to work, get back in time to check the homework folder, get her to bed, start again the next morning. That evening, before his rounds began, he had knelt beside the folding table and asked what she was drawing. He'd held up a picture of the hospital with an enormous yellow sun hovering over the roof and told him, with the total seriousness only a 6-year-old can manage, that the sun was there because sick people need something good to look at. He had kissed the top of her head and told her that was about the smartest thing anyone had said to him all week. And he meant it. The uniform did more work than people realized. It wasn't just a job. It was a kind of armor, The specific invisibility that comes from wearing a badge nobody bothers to read past the first word. Doctors walked past him without breaking conversation. Families in the visitors' lounge looked through him the way you look through a chair you don't need yet. He had grown almost grateful for it, in the years since Renee died, because invisibility asked nothing of him. It didn't require him to explain why a man with his training was buffing linoleum for $14 an hour. It didn't require him to defend a decision that made sense only to the people who understood what it cost to keep making it anyway. Being unseen, he had discovered, was its own kind of peace. Right up until the moment it wasn't. It was refilling the hand sanitizer dispenser outside room 412 at 7:40 p.m. when the first code call went out over the intercom. Sharp and clipped, the kind of announcement that made every staff member within earshot move a half step faster without breaking stride. Pediatric surgical recovery. Room 412. He didn't need to be told which room. He was standing outside it. Through the narrow window in the door, he watched a boy who could not have been older than 7 going pale on the bed in a way skin does when the body has quietly, catastrophically, started giving up. Not the flushed alarm of fever, not the blotch of allergy, but a gray, draining stillness that Elijah had seen exactly twice before in his life. Both times in triage tents 6,000 miles from here. The nurse was calling for the attending. A second nurse was pulling the crash cart. And standing against the far wall, arms wrapped around herself so tightly her knuckles had gone white, was a woman Elijah recognized from the hospital's donor wall in the main lobby. Renata Ellison, founder of Ellison Biotech, one of the wealthiest women on the East Coast, who had funded the very surgical wing her son was now dying inside of. Noah Ellison had gone in for what should have been a routine appendectomy that morning. Uncomplicated, textbook, the kind of procedure a children's surgical unit performed on a near-weekly basis without incident. He had come out of anesthesia fine. He had eaten broth at lunch. And then, somewhere around 6 o'clock, his temperature had begun climbing in a way that didn't track with any standard post-operative infection curve. Spiking, dropping, spiking again. His heart rate following the same erratic rhythm. His blood pressure sliding downward no matter what fluids they pushed. The attending surgical team had cycled through the obvious answers one at a time. Sepsis from a perforation. Reaction to anesthesia. A missed internal bleed. Each time, the labs and the imaging came back just slightly wrong for the diagnosis. Close enough to justify the treatment, not close enough to actually fit. Elijah stood at that window for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. He counted them without meaning to. It was an old habit, one that had never fully left him. He watched the resuscitation team push broad-spectrum antibiotics for a sepsis picture that wasn't behaving like sepsis. He watched the erratic fever curve on the monitor. Up 2 degrees, down 1.4, up again in a jagged, syncopated rhythm that had nothing in common with a standard bacterial infection and everything in common with something he had only ever seen in the field. In soldiers who'd been bitten by something no one thought to ask about until it was almost too late. A relapsing pattern. Not steady, cyclical. He thought about the appendectomy incision site. He thought about the hospital's rural surgical outreach program, the one whose brochures hung in the lobby. The one that had, according to a memo he'd read taping up a bulletin board 3 weeks earlier, sent a mobile surgical unit to a farming community 2 counties over the week before Noah's procedure, the same unit now being cleaned and rotated back into St. Augustine's main inventory. He thought about ticks. He thought about the particular cyclic fever pattern of a tick-borne relapsing infection, misread as post-surgical sepsis because nobody had asked the one question that mattered. Had anything bitten this child in the last 2 weeks? And had the surgical equipment used on him been anywhere near livestock country? He had no proof. He had a hunch built on 11 years of pattern recognition and a hallway view through a 6-inch window, the kind of certainty that would sound, if he said it out loud to the wrong person, exactly like a man with no medical license overreaching into a conversation that wasn't his to have. He knew how it would look. A janitor, walking into a private room, telling a team of specialists they'd missed something obvious. You could already hear the sentence forming in someone else's mouth before he'd said a single word of it himself. And the last time he'd had a hunch like this and stayed quiet, telling himself it wasn't his place, that the people with diplomas surely knew better than a man whose only training had come from a war zone. He had buried his wife 9 days later. He pushed the door open. The room did not stop and turned to face him the way rooms do in the movies. The charge nurse glanced up, registered his uniform, and looked back down at the monitor, already dismissing him as a wrong-turn interruption. It was the hospital's night administrator, Gerald Voss, hovering at the doorway to monitor optics on a high-profile patient, who turned fully around, and whose expression moved from confusion to something colder within about a second and a half. This is a closed treatment room, Voss said. You need to leave. Now. I think I know what's wrong with him, Elijah said. His voice didn't rise. It never did. The fever pattern's cyclical, not steady. That's not standard post-op sepsis, I think. You're the janitor, Voss said, and the word came out of him with a flatness that made it sound less like a job title and more like a verdict. Get him out of here. Two things happened at once. The attending surgeon, a tired, focused woman named Dr. Amara Bilal, glanced up from the bedside with an expression that suggested she was 2 seconds from ordering a 4th round of a medication that wasn't working. And Renata Ellison, still pressed against the far wall, said nothing at all. Just watched, her eyes moving from her son's monitor to the stranger in the doorway and back, cataloging the room the way people do when they've run out of better options and are searching, almost against their will, for a new one. Sir, I need you to step outside, said the charge nurse, already moving toward him. His fever's cycling, Elijah said, louder now but still level, still even, the voice of a man who had learned in combat that panic never made anyone listen faster. Up 2. Down 1.4, up again. That's not sepsis. That's relapsing fever. Ask if the surgical kit came through the rural outreach rotation. Ask if anyone checked him for a tick bite. Get security, Voss said. That was when the guard's hand closed around Elijah's arm. It did not drag him far. 20 feet, maybe 30, down the corridor toward the service elevator, Voss trailing behind, muttering about liability and unauthorized personnel and the optics of a member of the cleaning staff making unsolicited medical claims to a family whose name was on the building. Elijah did not fight the grip. He had learned that too, a long time ago. That struggling only ever confirmed to people exactly the story they'd already decided to believe about you. He simply kept talking, low and clear, over his shoulder, to anyone who might still be listening. Ask him about a tick bite. Ask him about the mobile unit. Nobody stopped the guard. That was the part that would stay with the staff longest afterward, when they replayed it in their heads. 6 people stood in that hallway. Nurses, an orderly, a resident on his way to another floor. And all 6 of them watched a man be forcibly removed for saying something none of them had thought to check, and not one of them said a word. 2 of them had their phones half raised, recording without quite deciding to, the way people do now when something feels wrong but not wrong enough yet to intervene. One of the nurses, an experienced woman named Patricia who had worked the surgical floor for 11 years, would later admit in her incident statement that something about the way Elijah spoke, the specificity of it, the calm, had made her want to say something. She hadn't, because it wasn't her patient, and because Voss outranked her, and because in 11 years she had learned exactly how much trouble it cost to be the person who spoke up in the wrong room at the wrong time. The silence in that hallway was its own kind of decision. Nobody chose to be cruel, but they simply chose not to be the one who spoke first, and in the space that opened up because of it, a sick child kept getting sicker. Only one person moved. Sophia Reyes was a first-year nurse, 24 years old, still new enough to the building that she hadn't yet learned which rules were load-bearing, and which ones were just furniture. She didn't stop the guard. She didn't have the standing to, and she knew it. But she peeled off from the group, walked fast down the side stairwell, and caught up to Elijah just as the guard released him at the loading entrance with a final, unnecessary shove. "What did you mean, relapsing fever?" she said, breathless. "Say it again." "Exactly what you said in there." Elijah looked at her for a second. Really looked. The way you look at the one person in a burning building who turned around instead of running. "Typical fever pattern," he said. "Tick-borne relapsing infection. Ask about the surgical instrument rotation. Ask if anyone's checked his skin for a bite mark, especially near the incision or the groin. Anywhere a tick might have gone unnoticed under a hospital gown before surgery. If I'm wrong, it costs you 2 minutes. If I'm right, you're already an hour behind." Sophia didn't wait to be convinced twice. She went back inside. She did not go to Voss. She went straight to Dr. Bilal, catching her at the doorway of room 412, as the surgeon shrugged off one antibiotic protocol and reached, without much conviction, for another. "Doctor, I know this is going to sound strange," Sophia said, "but there's a man who used to work maintenance who just said something about a cyclical fever pattern and a tick bite, and I think you should hear it before you push the next round." Dr. Bilal did not have time for strange. She had a patient crashing in front of her and a mother against the wall who had gone past speaking entirely. But something in Sophia's voice, the specific, technical shape of the phrase cyclical fever pattern, a term a janitor should have no reason to know, made her pause with her hand still on the medication cart. "Bring him back," she said. It took 90 seconds to find him. He hadn't gone far. He was sitting on an upturned crate by the loading dock, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing, doing the math on whether he'd just cost himself the only job that let him be home for his daughter's bedtime. When the door swung open and Sophia said his name, he stood up before she finished the sentence. He walked back through the same corridor that had just expelled him, past the same staff members who had watched in silence minutes earlier, none of whom now met his eyes. Dr. Bilal was waiting at the door of 412, arms crossed, her expression unreadable in the specific way of someone deciding, in real time, how much professional risk she was willing to absorb on the word of a stranger in a gray uniform. "Who said cyclical fever pattern?" she said without preamble. "Say the rest." He said it the way he'd learned to say things that mattered. Short, sequenced, no hedging. The temperature curve, up and down instead of steady. The timeline. Appendectomy that morning, decline that started roughly 6 hours post-op, too fast for a typical surgical site infection to explain the severity, and yet not matching the flatline pressure drop of an internal bleed either. Surgical kit rotation. A detail he'd only half-registered off a bulletin board memo 3 weeks earlier, but one that placed a piece of Noah's surgical equipment in a rural tick-endemic county the week prior. And then the question nobody in that room had thought to ask all day. Had anyone actually looked at this child's skin? Bilal turned to the nurse beside her. "Full skin check now? Groin, scalp, behind the ears, axilla, everywhere a gown covers." Voss, still hovering near the door, opened his mouth to object to the interruption, to the optics, to the liability of taking direction from unauthorized personnel. And Dr. Bilal, without even turning her head, said, "Not now, Gerald," in a tone that ended the conversation before it started. The tick was found 90 seconds later, engorged and dark, tucked into the crease behind Noah's left knee, a location the surgical drape had covered completely during the appendectomy, and that no post-operative check had reason to examine. It hadn't caused the appendicitis. It had simply been there, waiting, feeding, while the surgical team's attention was entirely elsewhere, and it had chosen the worst possible week to make itself known. Renata Ellison had not spoken in 11 minutes. She spoke now. "Is that?" she started, and couldn't finish the sentence. "That's likely your answer," Dr. Bilal said, already reaching for the phone to call infectious disease down. Cyclical relapsing fever from a tick-borne pathogen, layered on top of post-surgical stress. "We've been treating the surgery. We need to be treating the bite." So she looked at Elijah for a long moment, the kind of look that strips a person down to what they actually know versus what they merely claimed. "How do you know this?" "I used to be a corpsman," Elijah said. "Combat medic, Marine Corps, 2 deployments. I've seen relapsing fever in the field more times than I've seen a hospital lab confirm it inside the first 6 hours. It doesn't look like what the textbooks describe. It looks like this." The room went quiet in a way that had nothing performative about it. No gasp, no dramatic stillness, just the particular silence of half a dozen trained professionals recalibrating, in real time, everything they thought they understood about the man standing in the doorway. It was Dr. Priya Nandakumar, the hospital's head of infectious disease, paged down 12 minutes later, who said his name out loud in a way that changed the room a second time. He walked in already reading the chart, already half focused on Noah, moving with the brisk, distracted efficiency of a specialist who had been pulled out of dinner and expected to hit the ground running. Then she stopped, mid-stride, looked at Elijah standing quietly against the wall in his gray uniform, and said, "Wait, M1 Carter." The room's attention shifted toward her instead of him for a moment, confused by the sudden change in her voice. She didn't answer right away, so she kept going, half to him and half to the room at large, as if she needed to say it out loud to believe it herself. "I did a rotation through Bethesda 6 years ago, infectious disease fellowship, and there's a paper, not published, more of an internal field report, on atypical relapsing fever presentation in deployed personnel. Case series, no formal authorship listed, just a handful of names buried in the acknowledgments because nobody thought to credit the corpsman who'd actually documented half the cases. Carter, that's you. I remember your name because I used your notes to write my own differential 3 separate times that year." "So that was a long time ago," Elijah said. "It's the reason we know what we're looking at right now," Dr. Nandakumar said, and turned to the room. "Start doxycycline empirically. Don't wait on the tick panel confirmation, and get me his full surgical timeline cross-referenced with instrument sourcing. I want to know if we've had a sterilization gap." Then, to Voss, who was still standing near the door in a posture that had shifted from authoritative to visibly smaller. "Who removed this man from the floor?" Nobody answered right away. Renata Ellison answered instead. "He did. she said, nodding once at Voss, her voice quiet but carrying the flat, load-bearing certainty of someone who had spent the last 20 minutes recalculating exactly what she owed and to whom. I watched him do it. Voss tried, briefly, to explain himself. Protocol. Liability. An unauthorized staff member making unverified claims in a family's private treatment room. The standard justifications for a decision that had made perfect sense to him 11 minutes ago, and made none at all now. Dr. Bilal cut him off without raising her voice. He was right, and you had him thrown out of a room where a child was dying, she said. We can talk about protocol after Noah's stable. Right now, get out of the way. Noah's fever broke by 2 a.m. Not dramatically. No sudden cinematic turn. Just a slow, stubborn retreat, degree by degree. The kind of recovery you had to watch the monitor closely to believe was real. But it was real. By 4 a.m, his color had returned. His heart rate had settled into a steady, boring rhythm that was, for the first time all night, exactly what a heart rhythm was supposed to look like. Dr. Nandakumar's tick panel confirmed it before sunrise. The relapsing fever group Borrelia infection, caught early enough, thanks to 6 hours no one else in the building had thought to save, but it would leave no lasting damage at all. The internal review started before the sun came up. That was how these things worked. The hospital's risk management office was informed by 7 a.m. that a non-clinical staff member had entered an active treatment room, made unsolicited diagnostic claims to a high-net-worth patient's family, and had been physically removed by security before being readmitted at a physician's request. The framing of the incident report, in its first draft, managed to describe every part of what happened except the part where a child had nearly died of something nobody else in the room had caught. Elijah found out his shift had been suspended pending review from Dolores, who called him at 9 that morning while Maya ate cereal across the kitchen table, swinging her feet under her chair, oblivious. He told her yes, he could bring Biscuit to school today, and finished his coffee, and did not tell her that he might not have a job to come home to that night. Renata Ellison did not wait for the review board to finish its work. She met with the hospital's chief administrator that same afternoon, seated across a conference table from 3 risk management staff, and a lawyer she hadn't invited but who had shown up anyway, and she asked, without raising her voice, a single question. Can someone explain to me why the man who saved my son's life was dragged out of the room by security, and why he is now the one being investigated? Nobody had a satisfying answer. Voss, called in to give his account, tried to shift the blame toward hospital protocol, toward the ambiguity of an unauthorized staff member's presence, toward the reasonable caution any administrator would exercise in a high-profile case. He used the word optics twice. He used the phrase unverified credentials 3 times, as though the number of repetitions might eventually make the excuse truer. Dr. Bilal, present at Renata's request, let him finish before she spoke. When she didn't raise her voice either. She simply laid the timeline out in order, minute by minute, the fever curve, the removal, the 6 minutes lost, the tick finally found behind a knee nobody had checked, and said flatly that the protocol he was hiding behind had nearly cost a 7-year-old boy his life, and that no policy existed anywhere in the hospital's handbook that justified physically removing a person for correctly identifying a life-threatening diagnosis. Voss had no answer for the timeline. Nobody in the room did. Sorting, when it finally happened, took 3 weeks and left almost no ambiguity behind. Gerald Voss was placed on administrative leave, and, following a second incident report from 2 nurses who came forward once the first one broke the silence, was not brought back. He never publicly acknowledged what happened in that hallway as a mistake. In his final statement to the review board, he maintained that he had been following standard escalation and access protocol, a phrase that, read against the timeline Dr. Bilal had laid out minute by minute, satisfied no one. 2 of the physicians who had stood by silently during the removal were required to complete a mandatory retraining on escalation protocol. Staff reported clinical concerns, a quiet but pointed acknowledgement that watching wasn't neutral, that the 6 people in that corridor with their phones half raised had made a choice too, even if none of them would have called it that. Sophia Reyes, the only person in that hallway who had actually moved, was offered a formal role on the hospital's newly created Rapid Response Liaison team before she'd even finished her first year of practice, with Dr. Nandakumar personally requesting her by name and telling the credentialing committee, without exaggeration, that Sophia's 15 seconds of good judgment in a stairwell had likely saved a child's life as surely as any diagnosis had. It was Noah himself who asked the harder question, the one none of the adults around him had quite gotten to yet. Sitting up in his hospital bed 4 days later, color fully returned, tugging at the tape on his IV line the way small children do when they've decided they're bored of being sick. He looked at his mother and asked, if he was just the janitor, would anyone have listened to him if that other man hadn't come and remembered his name? Renata didn't answer right away. She thought about it the way she thought about hard problems at work, turning it over until the easy version of the answer fell away, and only the true one was left. No, she said finally. Probably not. That's the part we have to fix. Noah considered this with the grave seriousness of a child working through something that didn't have a satisfying ending yet, and then he asked a second question, quieter than the first. Isn't it their job to listen to people, even before they know who they are? Renata didn't have an answer for that one either. She just pulled the blanket up over his shoulders and told him it was supposed to be, and that she was going to spend a while making sure it actually was. She did not offer Elijah money. She understood by then, from the way he'd carried himself through every part of it, that it wasn't what the moment called for, and that offering it might have felt like an attempt to close the account rather than actually settle it. What she did instead was use Ellison Biotech's seat on the hospital's governing board to push through something more durable, the formal policy requiring that any staff member, regardless of role or title, who raised a specific, documented clinical concern be granted an immediate physician consultation before any decision to remove or dismiss them from a treatment area. No exceptions. No discretion left to administrators weighing liability against optics. They funded a credentialing initiative that let former military medical personnel working in non-clinical hospital roles formally register their background, so that expertise like Elijah's would show up in a system instead of depending on a single infectious disease specialist happening to remember a name from a 6-year-old acknowledgments page. She did it quietly, through board memos and policy language, without a press conference, because she had learned, watching Elijah operate, that credit was never really the point. 3 months later, St. Augustine's West Wing corridor looked exactly the way it always had. Same fluorescent lighting, same quiet hum of a hospital doing its ordinary, unremarkable work of keeping people alive. But the laminated card clipped to every staff badge now included a short, specific line about the escalation policy, and the mobile surgical unit's instrument sourcing log had been rebuilt from the ground up after the sterilization review Dr. Nandakumar had demanded turned up the gap everyone suspected was there. New hires now sat through a half-hour training module built directly from what happened in room 4012. No names used, no identifying details, just a case study in what it costs an institution when the person closest to the truth is also the person least likely to be believed. Dr. Nandakumar taught the first session herself, and made a point, every time, of ending it with the same line. Credentials tell you what someone was trained to say. They don't tell you who was paying attention. Elijah was back on the night shift, cart and all. Badge still reading Carter, Environmental Services. But now it carried a second line beneath it, small and easy to miss unless you were looking. Credentialed clinical background. HM1. USN, Ret. He hadn't asked for the addition. Dr. Nandakumar had put it there anyway, and when he found it, he didn't say anything about it to anyone, who just kept working. Maya still came in on the evenings the sitter fell through, coloring at the same folding table under Dolores's watch, biscuit propped against the napkin dispenser. Some evenings, Sophia stopped by on her break to show Maya a new coloring technique, or to ask Elijah, quietly, about a symptom pattern on a chart she couldn't quite place, because she'd learned by then that the man with the mop cart sometimes knew things the residents didn't. Noah visited twice that spring, once to bring Elijah a drawing. 2 figures, one in scrubs, one in gray coveralls, colored the exact same size, and once just to sit with Maya at the folding table and color next to her for 20 minutes while their parents talked in the hallway about nothing in particular. That evening, after Maya was asleep, Elijah sat at his kitchen table with the drawing propped against the sugar bowl, and thought about Renee. Not with the old, crushing weight of it, the guilt that had lived in his chest like a second heartbeat for 4 years, but with something closer to an ordinary ache, the kind you carry because you loved someone, not because you failed them. He thought about the difference between the silence he'd kept the last time it mattered, and the door he'd walked through this time, uninvited, unqualified on paper, absolutely certain in every other way that mattered. It hadn't required a title. It only required him to stop mistaking his own silence for humility, when what it had actually always been was fear. A person's worth was never supposed to be something you had to prove twice, once with the truth, and again with a stranger's memory of your name. Elijah understood, better than most, how much luck had been folded into that night. that Sophia had happened to be the nurse close enough to hear him, that Dr. Nanda Kumar had happened to be the specialist on call, or the paper he'd half forgotten writing had happened to survive 6 years in someone else's memory. Take any one of those things away, and the story ends in the loading dock, on an upturned crate, with a boy who never gets the diagnosis in time. That was the part that kept him up some nights, long after Noah had gone home healthy. Not what had gone right, but how easily, in 100 other versions of that same evening, it hadn't. Which was exactly why the policy mattered more to him than any of it. Luck wasn't a system. It couldn't be counted on to show up in the next room, or the one after that. The real work, he told Dr. Nanda Kumar once, wasn't in surviving the moment nobody believed him. It was in building something sturdy enough that belief stopped being the thing a person had to earn before anyone would listen. A worn jacket, a gray uniform, a name nobody bothered to read past the first word. None of it should ever be the reason a room takes 6 extra minutes to hear the truth standing in front of it. If this story moved you, subscribe and stay. There are more stories worth telling, and we're just getting started.